And welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, available on Pacifica Radio, Progressive Radio Network, on iHeartRadio, on iTunes, on Stitcher, on SoundCloud, and YouTube. My guest for this show is David Abulafia. He is an Emeritus Professor of Mediterranean History at Cambridge University. He's the author of many books, including The Great Sea, A Human History of the Mediterranean, and his newest book, which we'll be discussing, is The Boundless Sea, A Human History of the Oceans. So welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
Now, you start your book in the preface talking about connections, literally saying in the making of connections between human societies, the role of the sea is particularly fascinating. Connections across large, mainly uninhabited open spaces have brought together people's religions and civilizations in stimulating ways. Now, I call my show the Bottom Up Show because I think we're transitioning from a top-down to a more bottom-up culture. Bottom up is all about connection. Bottom up is what I believe is the way humans evolved to be when they were in hunter-gatherer bands, living in the wild, really, before civilization. And it's mostly about a kind of a consciousness of how other people are and making decisions based on how they are. I've written about bottom-up history versus top-down history. The history of the world used to be discussed in top-down ways, looking at kings, generals, and tycoons, and that's changed. And now the study of history casts its lens on all different aspects of humanity. Your book explores the history of humanity's relationship to the oceans and how oceans influenced humanity and culture. I see that as a bottom-up approach to understanding history, really.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And what I'm trying to do in the book is to get away from the history of kings and emperors and indeed even admirals and navies and look more at, I wouldn't say the ordinary people, because a lot of these people were not at all ordinary, like Columbus, but people who crossed the sea often in enormous numbers. Following in the wake of the great explorers, you've got, the opening up of trade routes, and the trade routes bring all sorts of connections between, as I say, religions, between cultures that hadn't even known that each other existed. So it's that sort of fascination of things very far apart that become close together as a result of the sea in a way that doesn't really happen over land. It's much more difficult to affect that across a landmass because you've got all the other intermediate peoples and places and so on which get in the way. But you think about contact right across the Atlantic, right across the Indian Ocean, right across the Pacific with these galleys going all the way from Manila in the Philippines to Mexico, and worlds which were completely different in their culture, coming into contact and maintaining this contact and remolding one another in the process.
Yes, and you start the book 176,000 years ago. I mean, that's a pretty precise time stamp there. Why 176,000 years ago?
Well, one is dependent on the archaeologists and their dating and what they've actually discovered. These very small humans who've been discovered in the island of Flores in Indonesia, that sort of thing. It takes one way back.
Oh, wait! I heard you broke down. You said the island of Flores and
Indonesia. In Indonesia.
Okay.
The island of Flores in Indonesia, where they discovered just in the last couple of decades these miniature humans who seem to have had brains the size of chimpanzees, but nonetheless managed to get across the water because these islands were disconnected from Asia. And they've just discovered more of the same sort of thing in the Philippines. So if you're talking about people crossing the sea, you really want to go right back to the beginning. And right back at the beginning, long before humans like us existed, people were crossing the sea. And it's one of the most fascinating questions. How on earth was it accidental? I mean, some people say maybe they just got thrown in a storm. They sort of attached themselves to a log and were swirled across the sea for hundreds of miles. To me, that doesn't make sense. I think people learned how to cross water stage by stage many, many thousands of years ago.
So, and you talk in the book about how they probably started learning how to deal with rivers, then lakes,
Exactly.
and then gradually getting out into the coastal waters and then beyond.
Yeah, nobody says that. It's extraordinary. You read all the literature, and everybody says, oh, how did they manage to cross the sea? But the fact of the matter is, to get from Africa, where our sort of human evolved, all the way to the east coast of Asia, they had to cross enormous numbers of rivers, wide, angry rivers. They had to get across these things. They came across lakes, and sometimes it was more convenient to build something that would take them across the lakes. So humans have worked out how to cross water way before they learned how to cross oceans. But one thing leads to another.
I want to stay with the floras and now those little people. They have been called hobbits.
Hobbits, yes.
And they were about a meter tall.
Meter, yeah.
That's fascinating. And so where were they? Where is Flores? And tell us more about that, because I think that's that and the idea that they may have connected with the Denisovans. Tell us about them, where they fit in the time frame.
Yes. Well, this is in that whole mass of islands, Bali and all these places, which form part of Indonesia. So a very long way from the main landmass of Asia. That's the really important thing. They would be a totally separate branch from the Denisovans. The Denisovans, of course, are fascinating because nobody's discovered a Denisovan skull, but it's been established using DNA. I mean, DNA has transformed our understanding of the movement of humans across the globe. And to have this additional form of human, we all know about Neanderthals, but another form who were probably quite like Neanderthals. And then to discover that in all of us, I mean, those of us who are of European descent, right, so we have a lot of Neanderthal DNA. I mean, not an enormous amount, but we have a significant amount. And those who are of East Asian descent, and also the native population of Australia, I think southern India perhaps as well, they have this Denisovan DNA. And it is extraordinary that, we'd assumed that we were just a separate victorious branch of humanity, and now we learn that humanity is made up of all these strands that have got interwoven with one another.
And even that's even the case for the miniature people of Flores too, or?
Well, that's the question. That is the question. What people have been saying in the last couple of years is really that we have to think of not a single strand, not even a multiplicity of strands, but strands that separate and then rejoin, and then separate again and rejoin. The whole thing is as if it's all sort of plaited together in a very, very complicated way. And that is our ancestry.
I wonder, are there maps of the world that are based on DNA?
Well, I don't think we've really reached that stage, but there should be. It would be a very interesting thing to see. I mean, what we can establish, for instance, about some of the peoples I mentioned in the book. I went on a research visit to the Dominican Republic 2 or 3 years ago, and the day I arrived, the Academy of History there announced these amazing results. They'd actually analyzed the DNA of the Dominican population, and you look at Dominicans, and they're quite a range of sort of physical types, but they'd managed to establish what percentage was of African descent, because of course there was a very large slave trade bringing African slaves into the Caribbean, what percentage was of Spanish descent, what percentage was, they had some extraordinary mixtures. You had Jews, you had Bretons, you had all sorts of people you didn't quite expect to find. And then the original native population, very small, but at least there were some of them, because we'd always assumed that the native population of the Caribbean had been completely wiped out. And in fact, they do survive in genes of modern, well, what we would call sort of West Indians in many parts of the world.
Interesting. So your book is huge. I mean, it's over 1,000 pages.
Yeah.
Before we started, you said that your agent said it was the biggest book he's ever represented, and it's the biggest book I've ever done an interview on. And it covers all the world's major oceans and how trade and commerce existed, and it starts off with the earliest ocean, that's the Pacific.
The Pacific,
also called the South Sea, or
yes. I mean, the Pacific might not seem the most obvious place to begin, because it is the sea which, from a sort of Eurocentric perspective, and by Eurocentric I would also include sort of East Coast America at any rate, from that perspective, it's most remote. It's the one we got to know last, really, well after the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, from the European point of view. But it is the place in which we have this extraordinary movement of people going back many, many millennia, across, slowly but surely, across that space, all the way to Easter Island in the middle of absolutely nowhere. And so we can trace this sort of human conquest from Hawaii in the north right down to New Zealand, a process which was only completed. Some people think that New Zealand was only colonized around 1350, that is AD, CE 1350. Really, almost within our own memory, if you see what I mean, compared to some of these very, very early settlements which took place.
To get back, what was 176,000 years ago? What does that mark?
Well, that marks simply the turning up of the very first people in Australia and the Indonesian islands and that sort of thing, which is a bit of a dead end, because, as I say in my part of a chapter on Australia, the Australian native population, they moved inwards. Australia was more fertile many, many millennia ago than it is now, and they tended to move inwards, away from the sea. And really the people who engaged with the Pacific were the Polynesians, who are an amazing mix. I mean, people largely speaking languages that seem to have originated somewhere around Taiwan. But you have this vast area, so that when Captain Cook in the late 18th century arrived in Hawaii and arrived in New Zealand, he found that these two areas, which are so far apart, that his interpreter could make himself perfectly well understood in both places, that the same language was spoken. And in fact, Polynesian languages are even spoken as far west as Madagascar, because Madagascar, this large island off Africa, was settled by people from probably somewhere like Borneo in what we would call the Middle Ages. It's an extraordinary story of crossing massive ocean spaces and colonizing these islands and knowing how to master the sea in the most extraordinary way. One of my favorite stories in the book is the story of the British captain who lost his compass overboard. He was trying to get to somewhere like Tahiti, and he had a Polynesian crew. It was a European type ship, but he had a Polynesian crew. He relied on his instruments. And he said to his crew, I've lost my compass, I've lost my instruments, how are we going to get to Tahiti? And they said, don't worry, Captain, we'll get you there. And they, from there, they didn't have written sources. They simply had this instinctive knowledge. They knew how to interpret the sea.
Well, wait.
And then wait a minute, they get there, and he says, but how did you know it was here? And they say, well, it's always been here. That's the point. They had this command, which actually Europeans, we imagined that we knew, with our instruments and maps and so on. But they could do it. They had this mental map, which their navigators carried, which was quite extraordinary.
And the reason I interrupted you is it wasn't instinctive at all. They had a discipline, and they had shared knowledge and wisdom that they transferred from generation to generation. And they learned how to listen. They learned how to use their senses. In your book, you describe how they learned how to feel the waves.
Yeah, well, when I say instinctive, I mean that it was something that they reacted directly to without actually having to go through, you're right to question the term, but without having to go through an elaborate process of calculation, without having to consult astronomical tables like, Columbus. It's a totally different way. It's a way of simply sort of knowing that, you feel sort of shuddering under the boat, and well, there's land not terribly far away with these sky conditions, color of the sea, and it all adds up, and you read all these signs. So it's almost like instinct.
I guess the reason I like to really be clear about that is because I really believe that before technology, people were really smart, and they developed very resourceful ways of doing things that once technology has come, we've lost and thrown away some of them. But what they were able to accomplish was extraordinary.
Yeah, and I deal with that a bit in the chapters on the early Atlantic, because in the age of Stonehenge, well, I don't say much about Stonehenge, but some of these settlements along the edges of Europe, all the way up to the islands of Scotland, the Orkney Islands and Shetland, you have these extraordinary buildings, these extraordinary structures, which show a degree of astronomical knowledge, which is quite astonishing. And yet this was done without actually having, as far as we know, any type of writing. These people were just doing it. I mean, they may have made little sort of signs with a stick on the ground or something, but they were doing it by transmitting orally the scientific knowledge, I think we can call it scientific knowledge, that they had.
Yes, it's fascinating. So what I'm interested in, you get into incredible detail about many different ports and the merchant trades and what have you. And I'm interested in how the reason I decided I wanted to interview you is that there's the promise that this book and you can explain how the sea affected humans' culture's development and growth. And so one question is, what are the metaphors of the sea that have affected the way people see the world?
That's a difficult question. And of course, it takes one into the world of sort of literature and I mean, I suppose one way of approaching it would be to say that as I look at the different oceans, I very often quote, famous works of literature. There's Beowulf, the Anglo-Saxon, the great Anglo-Saxon epic, which talks about wars between the Danes and other peoples and so on in the very early Middle Ages. And this sort of idea of the sea, which the Vikings also had, as a space which was both accessible and also mysterious, which held out certain threats always. There was always that element of danger. We do exaggerate probably the extent to which people feared the sea, because once they'd actually mastered the sea routes, they became quite confident of their ability to cross them. But nonetheless, that sort of mixture of on the one hand, knowing that it opened up opportunities for everybody, particularly trading opportunities, or opportunities to go and settle in other lands or whatever. And at the same time, the sort of mystery which is expressed. There's an illustration in the book. There's going to be an illustration showing one of these Viking ships, which is on a sort of memorial stone found in Sweden. And what you have is there, it's probably the journey of the soul to the next world. So this idea that crossing the sea is also like crossing the boundary between life and death. That's a very interesting, so that's one metaphor which I think is very interesting.
And you wrestle with the idea of why do people do it?
Why do people, indeed, why do people do it? And there are a number of ways this has been approached. There was one archaeologist recently he wrote a very good book in which he said, well, it's to do with the fact that many, not all human beings, but many human beings, that we have this sort of inbuilt adventurousness that, you know, if you like, it's part of our DNA, to come back to that risk-taking and so on is something that humans just do. The wish to explore, you know, the wish to climb Mount Everest. I do wish myself to climb Mount Everest, but there's some people for whom it's a great passion. I would say that there's something beyond that as well, which is more what I'm dealing with in the book, which is a little bit more sort of another aspect of human nature, which is actually the wish to take a risk to make a profit. My book is very much bound up with traders, with people searching out for goods, trying to establish trade routes, trying to enrich themselves through taking the risk of crossing the sea, knowing that if they succeed in finding sources of gold like the Portuguese or whatever, they will have really made their fortune forever. So that's the sort of, if you like, darker motive, which I think is very important there. And then, of course, also people cross the sea in the hope of getting a better life as settlers. So you think of people, you know, the Mayflower or whatever, people crossing the Atlantic in the hope of settling in a new world, but then discovering how dangerous it was, how many of them died of disease the moment they arrived.
So you talk in the book about how the ocean has risen and fallen, and that sea levels were as much as 100 feet lower, 100 meters, over 300 feet lower than they are today. That's huge.
It is huge. Of course, this is in the very remote past, and a lot of it's to do with issues, I wouldn't say global warming, global cooling, but the ice age, the melting of the ice, all that sort of thing, leading to a very significant rise in sea levels, which means that if you go far back in time, for instance, the Rock of Gibraltar, which now sticks right out of the sea between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, but originally there was a very large plain in front of it, which stretched some way towards Africa, and equally on the other side. So this makes it all actually sometimes more difficult for historians and archaeologists. I mean, in Polynesia, although there we're dealing with, by 2,000 years ago, much smaller changes in sea level, nonetheless, a lot of the interesting archaeological sites are actually below the waterline. So there are things we'd love to know, but we can never recover.
And what is interesting is what you say is that when the sea level is low, people are less likely to embark on voyages because they have more land.
They have more land, yeah. My Polynesians, the great question about the Polynesians is, why did they keep moving? It's a slow process. I mean, it took hundreds and hundreds of years, but why did they move eastwards over this long period? What were they looking for? And so people have bound this up very much with questions like overpopulation, right? So if the land is contracting and populations continuing to grow, then obviously people will go and look for new land. And linked to that were inheritance customs, which would, in certain societies, would deny younger sons, not to mention daughters, would deny them a share in the land. So younger sons might be encouraged to go and find new lands. So you would have this in Polynesia, you'd have it among the Vikings, going out to Iceland and Greenland and so on. So that's the sort of motive, but there might be other motives that we don't know much about, like religious motives. It may be that the Polynesians were going in search of the sun or something like that. I mean, nobody talks about that in the literature, but you know, there may
that would be a religious exploration.
That'd be a religious explanation, and very difficult to recover when you have no written sources. All you have is the archaeological evidence.
And what about the archaeological evidence? I mean, I would think that if you go back pretty far, there's not much in the way of boats that have survived. I mean, what is there? How far back does it go?
Yeah, boats, of course, are a real problem because being made of wood, it's only in certain types of condition that the wood will survive. So sometimes in very boggy land or sometimes very dry conditions. So you really have to depend, further back you go, you have to depend on things like drawings scratched on a wall. So the first two illustrations in the book will actually be, in the first place, a modern reconstruction of a Polynesian boat with this distinctive type of sail, what's called a claw sail, where it sort of dips at the top. And then underneath that, we're going to print a picture of, which comes from a rock carving, also somewhere in Polynesia, which appears to show, we don't know the exact date, appears to show the same sort of ship. And
okay, and we need to take a break now, just for a show ID. So basically, we need a pause so I can find it to do the edit, and I'll edit it in a bumper for the radio show.
Yeah.
Just My guest for the show is David Abulafia. He is Emeritus Professor of Mediterranean History at Cambridge University. His newest book, which we're discussing, is The Boundless Sea, A Human History of the Oceans. So we were talking about the problem of not having boats. So one of the things you use is rat archaeology.
Raft.
Well, rat.
Oh, rat. Oh, sorry. Yeah, well, rats, of course, I mean, one of the very fascinating things for me is these territories, whether they're in the Pacific or the Atlantic or the Indian Ocean, these uninhabited islands that people discover. And when they discover them, of course, they bring with them on their ships, they bring animals and all sorts of things from the old world. The point about these remote islands is there's no way in which mammals can have developed independently on these islands. They're completely isolated. You'll have birds, but you won't have mammals. You'll have reptiles, probably. So when you find rat bones, you then can begin, you know, with modern techniques, they can date the bones. But it always gets a little bit complicated. You know, arguments in New Zealand about whether this rat is older than that rat and so on. But you're right, this is the sort of thing you have to rely on. And it's one of the fascinating things about archaeology nowadays, of course. It's not about discovering pyramid-type structures. It's sometimes these very, very small things out of which you can construct a much more complete picture of these early societies.
Now, I know there have been some interesting developments using satellite imaging to detect from up high patterns of civilization. Has that been used at all when it comes to seafaring and navigation and the oceans?
I don't think it would really be terribly useful for the sort of maritime archaeology which, I must admit, interests me a lot, which is identifying shipwrecks. That's the thing. If you could find, if there was some technique of penetrating below the surface of the sea, of being able to see below the surface, which you can obviously do in very shallow water, but even then, I mean, the chances are that a shipwreck would have been covered by mud and so on. So I think really the situation with that sort of maritime archaeology is it's very hit and miss. Somebody discovers by chance a wreck, and then it's a battle between the treasure hunters and the archaeologists who's going to get there first and find what's in the wreck.
And you talk a lot in the book about how one of the necessary aspects of the development of travel on the oceans was learning how to master the weather, like the monsoons and certain winds. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, this is particularly important for understanding one of the most important maritime connections in the history of humanity, which is the link across the Indian Ocean. The link between the Spice Islands or India and lands further to the west, particularly routes leading into the Mediterranean towards Alexandria in the Roman Empire and so on. And so getting across the Indian Ocean with the monsoon systems and understanding how the monsoons change during the year was a very important development. And the ancient Greeks, they were really Greeks who lived under Roman rule in Egypt. They began to work out how it was possible to take advantage of the monsoon. So what you actually did was you waited for particular winds, and then you could cut right across the open ocean to get to southern India. And this was tremendously important to the Romans, because back in Rome, the consumption of Indian pepper around the time of the eruption of Vesuvius, destruction of Pompeii, around that time, consumption of pepper was just phenomenal. So you had this constant stream of spices being carried right across the open ocean, way out of sight of land. You know, we tend to think of these early navigators as people who hug the coast, who don't really like going out of sight of land, even within the Mediterranean. But in fact, they worked out how to do this, and with spectacular results.
How about, I mean, that's technology, that's knowledge, and technology and knowledge get transferred to other aspects of culture. How did that apply to the times? So the Romans were into importing lots of pepper, and they learned how to understand the monsoons and how that enabled them to travel more effectively over the ocean. How did those kind of learnings affect the culture at the time?
Well, it's an interesting question, because there were certainly people. I mentioned the destruction of Pompeii, and the most famous victim of the destruction of Pompeii, the writer Pliny the Elder, who was there and got suffocated by the volcano. He actually wrote very critically of the effects of all this luxury trade on Roman society. So there's that sort of sense that, which you have in many societies, it was better in the old times when people lived more simply. That sort of argument. So he said, you know, we're spending millions and millions of silver coins each year on all this pepper and all these luxury goods. And then you get this again in the Chinese world. You get people saying, oh goodness, 2 generations ago, young men and women didn't wear silk. They ate cabbages, they didn't eat all this fancy food and so on. So the sort of sense that this building up of successful trade in prestigious goods is corrupting society was something which you find really across the world. It's repeated again and again.
So I have to get you to tell the story about the octopus.
The octopus. Well, yes, this is all to do with the discovery of New Zealand. And as I said, the discovery of New Zealand probably occurred very late in the 14th century AD. So although maybe there'd been earlier expeditions, but the settlement was recorded in these extraordinary myths among the Maoris, among the Polynesians who actually settled, first of all, the North Island. South Island is quite cold, so it wasn't so suitable for settlement, particularly if you came from Polynesia, where conditions were quite warm. So there is this story about how there's this octopus who, how does it go? The octopus who starts eating, the fishermen become more and more upset that there's this octopus which is eating the fish that they're trying to fish.
And the bait, you write in the book that
it's the bait. And so they work out a way of actually killing the octopus. They have to follow the octopus further and further south, right down to what is now Wellington Bay, so the capital of New Zealand. And it's a dramatization, really, of the way in which the first inhabitants of New Zealand came to know the coast of New Zealand and all these places along the coast. Because they had this, again, in their oral tradition, nothing written down till the 19th century, but in their oral tradition, they knew exactly which sailors had sat in which places on the boats that discovered New Zealand, that settled New Zealand.
And those boats were there because they were hunting this octopus that was
going south. That's one version of the story. Then there are other stories, of course, about other people who are sort of fleeing around for one reason or another. But the octopus story is the most dramatic, and it does end with the death of the octopus. So it's a good story.
It's a great story. So your seafaring changed the world in a lot of ways, and it shifted the nature of commerce, and it changed what people used. And you describe in the book how the difference between seafaring and overland is that people can gradually just go through different areas to get to wherever they're going. So it doesn't have the same dramatic effect as if somebody takes a boat and goes long distances and finds a very different culture.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about that difference some more.
Yeah. I mean, to me, just to begin with an example, the great example of this is how Europeans and also Americans living in what were then the 13 colonies came to know China and Chinese objects, and the fascination. It wasn't just a fascination with this blue and white pottery, which became very fashionable throughout Europe and the east coast of America, but tea. I mean, tea has a very important role in the creation of the United States, as you know. And the passion for tea, the quantities of tea that were being imported, all the way to England. Sweden was a very important center for the redistribution of China tea right across Europe and across the Atlantic. So the engagement of these two worlds, so any museum you go to, I mean, I've just been in the Baltic, and there you have museums with these beautiful examples of blue and white pottery, and then you would start reading the captions. All right, some of them are made in China, no, but some of them, it's Dutch porcelain manufacturers who realized that they could try and sort of imitate Chinese culture by producing the same sort of thing. So it had an enormous effect, not just on the relationship between China and the West, but on the way in which the West itself was developing, on taste, on fashion, all these things.
What about the transmission of different economic models?
Well, that's a difficult question, of course, and one of the words which I tend to avoid using is capitalism. I think I do say at one point that if you want, in a very general sense, define capitalists, people who invest their money, take the profit, reinvest the profit in new ventures and so on. You go right back to ancient Babylonia in the 3rd millennium BC. So that sort of sense that a very simple type of profit-making enterprise, which we might call in a very general way goes back way before the development of European capitalism, is something which I'm trying to bring out in the book. And you find it in various parts of the world. But what is really interesting to me is the contrast between those people, those merchants going out to make a profit, and the other sort of model, which I deal with very often, which is the tribute model, where the Chinese emperors or the Japanese emperors expect, rather than to trade with other people, they expect to deal in exchanges of goods, tribute against gifts. And that sort of the contrast between these two ways of doing business, and the way in which the deeper you get into the tribute model, this idea that, you know, the emperor will receive, the Chinese emperor will receive an enormous delegation bringing the most fantastic gifts from the Emperor of Japan to indicate the submission of the Emperor of Japan. But what's really going on behind the scenes, of course, is that all these diplomats and their massive staff of hundreds of people, they're all trading just like anybody else. They're all trying to get things like animal skins and so on to take back home, trying to get the best things they can out of China. So ultimately, that sort of profit motive trumps the other model, which is the tribute model.
How about Gutenberg and books?
Books, yes.
Where does that fit into the oceans and trade?
Well, two ways, of course, because as is often pointed out, the Chinese and then the Japanese and the Koreans started printing books well before Gutenberg, though using different methods. So that sort of sense that that culture was disseminated through printed works in the Far East on a massive scale, things like Buddhist literature and so on, well before what was happening in the West with the development of printing. That's one thing. The other thing is that with the development of printing, the knowledge about what was actually happening the other side of the world in the Atlantic developed on a massive scale. So the moment Columbus returned from his first voyage to the Caribbean, printed pamphlets began to be produced in their tens of thousands and translated one language to another. And that was what printing achieved. And then the next person to write extensively about this, Vespucci, after whom America is named, on an even larger scale, his publications, these little pamphlets, distributed all over Europe.
Your work broke up. You said Vespucci, right? That's Amerigo Vespucci.
Amerigo Vespucci, who gave his name, or whose name was attached rather by a cartographer to South America with the word America. That's how it would have been pronounced. And then the name became attached also, once people got to know about North America as well, to the other American continent. So Vespucci is important in that respect, but he's also important because his work, he described the life of the American Indians in a very, he enjoyed telling tall stories, basically. I mean, he enjoyed talking about cannibalism and all these things, which...
Well, wait, I think what you're saying is he characterized them as barbarous primitives, and that was the way that Europeans characterized indigenous people as part of their belief in their right to basically steal the land from them because they didn't worship the same God.
There's a lot of that. Columbus was... he was a bit ambiguous about this. He was a bit uncertain in his own mind because he wanted to show the king and queen in Spain that he had discovered civilized people. He thought that he'd reached the edges of the Chinese or Japanese empire. But basically, yes, this argument that these people lived primitive lives, that what they enjoyed most of all was eating one another. And Vespucci played a very important role in disseminating that view. And the printers, who seem to have rewritten Vespucci's works in an even more, what in Britain we would call red top. I don't know if there's the same term in America, but...
What's the term? I click?
Red top. It's the newspapers, the the down market newspapers which sell hundreds and hundreds of thousands of
Like
copies.
we call them tabloids here, I think.
Tabloids, yes, it's the same thing, yeah. It was the equivalent of tabloid journalism.
Okay, so my next question gets into the idea of colonization. Where does colonization fit into your narrative?
Well, there are several types of colonization, of course, which are taking place in my book. And one form of colonization, which we discussed a bit already, is the colonization of empty spaces, which by and large consisted of islands, the largest being Madagascar and Greenland and New Zealand, I suppose, and the creation of new societies based usually on some sort of European model, but in Polynesia, obviously, it's a different sort of model. So there's that. But then the issue of, indeed, of establishing a permanent presence. And this took all sorts of different forms. The Spaniards were much more interested in acquiring territory after 1492. And beginning with Columbus in what's now Dominican Republic, and then later on we have Mexico and so on, whereas the Portuguese and the Dutch and so on were more interested in trading stations. So it's a different sort of colonization, but it was still built on certain assumptions about the superiority, the moral superiority of Europeans, the obviously trying to introduce Christian religion, that sort of thing.
Okay. What about the role of oceans in war?
Well, I've rather downplayed, I mean, they're obviously very important. I mean, naval history, the sort of history which takes you from one naval battle to another, it has its fascination, of course, but the book isn't really so much about that. There are some big naval engagements that I talk about, particularly the Mongol invasions of Japan in the 13th century, which are quite dramatic and which have been confirmed by archaeological evidence. But yes, indeed, I mean, the competition between these European colonizers, take the Portuguese to establish themselves in the Indian Ocean, the battles, the ruthlessness of the Portuguese in wiping out local populations, in the contest between the Portuguese and the Turks, who also had big interests in the Indian Ocean through the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. All of this, of course, is a very important part of the story of how Europeans in particular managed to establish themselves across the oceans.
Okay. I listened to some YouTube talks that you gave, and you talked about the role of the Black Death in the development of capitalism.
Yes, the Black Death is, I mean, it's, of course, an absolutely horrific event, which mainly affected Europe and the Islamic world. As far as we know, China did not suffer from the Black Death, even though the disease spread from somewhere fairly close to China, westwards in the 14th century. So when you have half the population of Europe and the Mediterranean wiped out within a very short period of time, within about 4 years, you can imagine the effects on the economy, the effect on the labor force, effect on prices, effect on cultivation of the soil, the effects on long distance and short distance trade. All of this completely turned the world sort of upside down. The economy had to be completely reconstructed following this tremendous calamity. And it wasn't helped by the fact that the plague kept coming back. So every 10, 12, 15 years, there'd be another attack on plague. So just when the population began to recover a bit, down it went again as a result of another sort of plague. So the plague really had an enormous role to play in the reshaping of the European economy. And one way in which it did this, of course, was the problem of the fall, the lack of availability of labor. So how do you compensate for this? The Portuguese worked out a solution in the early 15th century. You bring in slaves. So they began in the Canary Islands, where the local population, they conquered some of the island population, carried off, and then it carried on along the coast of Africa. And this is really the beginning of that fateful slave trade, which sort of disfigures the history of humanity for the next 4 centuries.
But I brought up capitalism, and you turned to the slave trade. So the slave trade is part of the birth of capitalism, modern capitalism.
Well, I mean, capitalism, as I said earlier, I mean, in a certain sense, I would say that you find sort of capitalist methods exist well before the Black Death. As far as the effects of Black Death on capitalism are concerned, in some respects, actually, if you think of the effect it had on big banking houses and so on, which was quite negative at the time, it rather sort of arrested economic development in some of those areas. So I don't think really the Black Death, the Great Plague, had that much influence on the development of the way in which, in later centuries, the Portuguese or the Dutch traded across the Indian Ocean or the Atlantic or whatever. It's more a question of the way in which the whole economy of a very important part of the world, viz. Europe and the Mediterranean, had to be reconfigured. It might have had a particularly important effect, actually, on the Islamic world, which was entering a period of serious economic decline at that point.
And slavery, where does that fit into that picture then?
Slavery, well, cheap labor. Labor almost, costing you almost nothing. And as the Spaniards began to develop their colonies in the New World, as they succeeded through overwork in wiping out the population of the Caribbean, they replaced that population with black slaves.
The other way that they wiped out the population in the Caribbean and in South America was transporting disease.
Disease, yes. Disease, of course. I mean, to be fair, I mean, this is obviously all very controversial stuff, but the disease, they didn't know that they were carrying disease. What they did know was that the black slaves whom they imported from Africa would probably, by and large, only survive, some of them only 5 years, 10, 15 years if they were lucky, that overworked. These people have been worked to death, as the previous population, the Taino Indians, the native population of Hispaniola, Cuba, Puerto Rico, had also been worked to death. And it's that sort of relentless exploitation of the native population, even though they were supposedly, the native Indians were supposedly free subjects of the Spanish crown. I mean, it's an extraordinary, hideous story.
And it's a piece of the early history of capitalism, too. And
in the sense that the sugar, well, particularly when the sugar industry began to take off. The sugar industry began really in the Mediterranean, but then it took off in Madeira. And originally, in the 15th century, the people producing the sugar were actually free Portuguese and Italians and so on. And it gradually mutated as demand grew. It mutated into slave labor, and the conditions became worse and worse as well.
It's a fascinating book you have here. So I just want to do another station ID now. So the show is the Bottom Up Show. I'm Rob Call. I'm the publisher of opednews.com, as well as the host of the Bottom Up Show, which is available on Pacifica Radio and Progressive Radio Network and iHeartRadio. And my guest for this show is David Abulafia. He's an emeritus professor of Mediterranean history at Cambridge University, and his new book is The Boundless Sea, A Human History of the Oceans. So I've got a little bit of time left to cover a little bit more ground. And you have a chapter, The Wickedest Place on Earth.
Yeah.
That caught my attention. Let's tell us a little bit about that. That's about pirates and
pirates. Yeah. Well, people expect, of course, in a history of the oceans, they would expect quite a lot about pirates, and pirates do pop up in a great many chapters. But there is this moment in the 17th century when the English managed to install themselves in Jamaica and created this trading centre, Port Royal, which had this reputation of being the wickedest place on earth. I mean, I'm not saying it was much worse than all sorts of other centres of piracy and trade. And they were it was rather sort of parasitical. They were taking advantage of the fact that the Spaniards were sending their silver ships through, bringing silver originally from Peru all the way through Mexico and then through the Caribbean back to Europe. And the Spanish economy, the Spanish political system was in something of a crisis. So Spain was an easy victim of that. What's really interesting, the English hadn't in fact intended to capture Jamaica. They'd gone off to capture Hispaniola, now Dominican Republic and Haiti. And they'd been fought off. And they turned up in Jamaica really just sort of as a result of a defeat. And discovered that the Spaniards hadn't bothered to defend the island very well and didn't really have much interest in it. So they established themselves there. But then you start looking at these pirates, and everybody's got this image from film of Pirates of the Caribbean and so on. And of course, what you discover is that many of them were actually working under license for the English Crown, or for a brief period in the Republic, Oliver Cromwell. They're working under license. They're what we would actually call privateers, which is something slightly different. They have become quite successful merchants. One of them, Henry Morgan, is actually knighted by the king, becomes, in English eyes, a very respectable character, in fact. So piracy, it's something which was sort of built up. It's a little bit of a myth. There was a Dutch.
What you're saying then is there were pirates who were literally legitimized by the government.
Yeah, that was quite normal, quite common.
Not that different than what we have today in some ways, actually. Yeah. We've got to wrap. I just want to finish. You gave a talk and you cited something that was written on a house in Valencia. And I transcribed it. I wanted to read it to you. So, and this is, these are commercial merchants, and it went like this: I am an illustrious house built in 15 years. Fellow citizens, rejoice and see how good a thing is business when it does not give rise to lies in speaking, when it keeps faith with one's neighbor and does not deceive him, when it does not dedicate money to usury. The merchant who acts in this way will prosper galore and eventually enjoy eternal life. And where was that?
So that's late 15th century, and there was this tension in the Middle Ages between the deep suspicion people had, which was the Christian church encouraged this sort of deep suspicion, profit-making, of usury, of unfair profit-making. And on the other hand, there's this idea among the merchants, well, you can, of course, you can trade honestly. Honest trade, surely, is not something of which God and the church and so on should be disapproving.
And we get a wrap now. That's a good place to finish, I think. My guest for the show has been David Abulafia. He's an Emeritus Professor of Mediterranean History at Cambridge University and is the author of The Boundless Sea, A Human History of the Oceans. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you very much.